Response to intervention, or maybe you have heard the term RTI, is a framework that is receiving a decent amount of attention in the field of education today. We will spend the next little bit exploring the fundamentals of the concept and process. Where did it originate? What is it? Why is it important for you as a future educator? And what is necessary to make it work for students and for schools? What is it that we believe about children and learning? Take a moment to think about each statement on this slide and if you agree or disagree with each. Then determine why you believe the way you do. Is there a particular experience or set of experiences that have influenced your beliefs about students and learning? Although we have different experiences and views, we all should agree with the statements on this slide. The belief that all children can and do learn has changed our thinking about education in recent years. Most recently, the impact of practice and policy on federal legislation has been seen in the reauthorizations of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 2001, known as No Child Left Behind. And it's been seen in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004. In 2015, the President signed the Every Student Succeeds Act to replace NCLB as in the new General Education Accountability Law, but it is too soon to see the impact of this new policy. NCLB, and now ESSA, include provisions for school improvement or expectations for continuous improvement. Districts need to have a plan in place and make actions towards meeting the goals outlined within the plan. Additionally, adequate yearly progress, AYP, needs to be made for all children, including all ethnicity and racial groups, those with low socioeconomic status, English language learners, and students with disabilities. Mandates within IDEA 2004 outline that instruction must be tied to state standards, must be research-based, and delivered by a highly qualified teacher. This gives us confidence that the instruction provided will be effective with a large majority of the students. Also, progress monitoring would occur. Progress monitoring is ongoing assessment that's used to measure students' academic performance and evaluate the effectiveness of instruction. IDEA 2004 also included provisions for intervening early when a student struggles academically or behaviorally. Previously, most would wait until a student failed until services were put in place. All of these policies focus on data-based decision-making. There are many ways that IDEA 2004 overlaps with NCLB and now ESSA, many of which aim to close achievement gaps for subgroups of students, especially for those with disabilities. Most notably, connected to our discussion of response to intervention today, are research-based practices, instruction, and interventions. Both of these acts reference scientific-based instruction, and the earlier interventions are implemented with struggling learners, there are more opportunities for the students to learn skills. NCLB set forth holding schools, local agencies, and states accountable for improving the academic achievement of all students, and promoting school-wide reform and ensuring the access of all children to effective, scientifically based instructional strategies. Regarding IDEA, Congress stated to improve the academic achievement and functional performance of children with disabilities, including the use of scientifically based instructional strategies to the maximum extent possible. You can see how they really overlap. Now that we've looked at legislation and foundations behind the RTI process, what is it? RTI is a process that provides all learners with the opportunity to learn. RTI is a general education framework that involves research-based practices for delivering instruction and interventions. RTI is an example of the broader term Multi-Tiered System of Support, or MTSS. This framework includes data collection and progress monitoring techniques across various instructional settings to determine whether or not students are responding to instruction in positive ways. Multi-tiered systems of support can also be applied to behavior, which I will address in the next video. Now let's watch a side video that gives an overview of RTI.
Here, we'll look at a three-tiered model, often depicted as a triangle, as one example of how a tiered framework can be used as a school-wide strategy for instructing all students. All students will participate in Tier 1 instruction. At this level, they'll receive effective, differentiated instruction provided by the general classroom teacher as part of an evidence-based core curriculum. The evidence-based instruction offered at this level can be expected to meet the learning needs of 80 to 85% of all students. For students who don't respond adequately to Tier 1 instruction, more intensive interventions come into play. Tier 2 interventions build upon the differentiated instruction provided at Tier 1 by offering students more systematic instruction and interventions strategically designed to help them catch up in areas of difficulty. These interventions are usually delivered to a small group of students within the general classroom, either by the classroom teacher or by another team member supporting the teacher who has also been trained to deliver the interventions. Tier 2 interventions will be offered to the 15% of students for whom Tier 1 instruction was not sufficiently intensive to meet their specific learning needs. But here is a critical point. Students who receive targeted Tier 2 interventions continue to participate in general Tier 1 instruction. Tier 2 interventions do not replace the core curriculum, they supplement it. For example, Dennis has been selected to receive Tier 2 interventions based on the results of recent reading fluency data. He'll continue to participate in the 90 minutes of core reading instruction that is provided to all students in Tier 1 each day. But in addition, he'll spend another 30 minutes per day receiving targeted reading instruction at Tier 2. Under RTI, his opportunities for learning and for catching up to his classmates will have been extended. We've saved the most intensive interventions available for the small percentage of students who still lag significantly behind their peers in making academic gains. Tier 3 interventions supplement the previous tiers by providing the most intensive evidence-based interventions delivered to individual students or in very small groups. Again, the intensity of instruction at this level increases. The size of student groups is reduced, and their opportunities for direct instruction extended. Interventions in Tier 3 may be delivered by an intervention specialist or even a special education teacher. But again, these interventions supplement the instruction provided at Tier 1, not replace it. And students do not have to be identified as disabled in order to receive these interventions. Only about 5% of all students will require these intensive Tier 3 interventions. Of these students, only a portion may go on to require special ed services.
It's important to understand that students can and do move into and out of tiers with fluidity, depending on how well they're responding to instruction. These decisions are made by teams, including both general and special educators, and others such as an administrator, reading specialists, and parents. In some schools, the tiers may exist for numerous academic areas within the school. A student might need Tier 3 instruction for reading, but only receive Tier 1 instruction in math. There are 4 essential components of RTI: universal screening, evidence-based practices, progress monitoring, and database decision-making. Universal screening instruments may be standardized tests, diagnostic tests, or other instruments that help schools quickly assess all students to determine who is in need of immediate Tier 2 and Tier 3 services. Usually a school will administer the screening instruments multiple times throughout the year, most often in the fall, winter, and spring, to ensure that all students are screened and that no one falls through the cracks. In addition to identifying students who need additional support in Tier 2 or Tier 3, universal screening can answer a couple of questions. For one, is the core curriculum working? Does the instruction that teachers are providing to the gen ed classroom work for the majority of students? And is it effective for most students? Remember, usually we see that 80% of students benefit from the universal or core instruction. The second key element is the use of evidence-based practices. This means that teachers will use instructional methods that have gone through rigorous peer review processes and are known to be effective with the age and specific learning needs of the students in that class. Another important component of evidence-based practices is the need to develop the practice with fidelity. That means that teachers will use the evidence-based practice or deliver their instruction in the manner in which the developer recommended. There are many evidence-based practices to choose from. You can find examples of evidence-based practices in peer-reviewed journals and your textbooks. One of the best sites for practices that have undergone the most rigorous research is the What Works Clearinghouse website. Progress monitoring is another hallmark of RTI. Progress monitoring means that teachers will use reliable and valid testing instruments based on the standards of their subject area to frequently assess student learning. Many schools have common measures so that all students are evaluated using the same tools. Many schools use a form of progress monitoring called a curriculum-based measurement, or CBM. CBM should reflect the content being directly taught so the student progress or lack of progress can be identified and changes in instruction can be made. Here is an example. At the top of the slide is data from a child who is exceeding expectations, and the bottom shows a student who is not making progress. Finally, data-driven decision-making is a key element of any teaching in RTI. Teachers should use data derived from their CBMs and other assessment instruments to evaluate student process and make instructional decisions. Placements should never be made without the use of several reliable data points. Let's look at a few examples. This graph shows the number of words read correctly, and by taking a look at the data points, we see that the number of words correctly is increasing each week. So this student is making progress in reading. The graph you're looking at shows a student who, in these short reading probes that only last a few minutes, had a rate of reading words correctly that exceeded the goal or standard. That is the expectation that we have for a student's progress. Therefore, this CBM graph indicates that this student is making adequate progress with Tier 1 interventions. Here you see a different story. Let's take a closer look at this graph. This student is not making adequate progress. This student started out the year at a level that was consistent with achievement expectations, but did not make progress as the weeks went on, and you see during weeks 6, 7, and 8 that the student is performing below the goal line. Therefore, the Tier 1 instruction was not effective for this student, and this student needs extra instruction or Tier 2 intervention. The beautiful thing about curriculum-based measures is that the data are instructionally relevant, and a school that collects CBMs demonstrates accountability because the school is monitoring each student and taking responsibility for all learners making progress. Effective RTI schools rely heavily on problem solving based on student data. To be most effective, a team approach is recommended for problem solving within an RTI framework. We introduced this earlier when I mentioned that decisions are made by teams, including both general and special educators. Using the CBM data, teams answer the question, is there a problem? Or reason to be concerned about the child's level of achievement? It is not left up to the speculation, but it's left up to data. If the data show there is a problem, then the problem-solving team determines why the problem is happening, or why is it that the child's not learning and not progressing as expected. When this happens, the next step is to come up with a Tier 2 intervention. The Tier 2 intervention is the answer to the question. It's the answer to the question that says, what should be done about the low achievement in order to catch the child up with age-level expectations? Finally, the next step is to collect more CBM data to answer the question, is the Tier 2 intervention working? And as you can see, the process is ongoing. Answering the fourth question leads back to the first question. In using this problem-solving model, it is critical that educators precisely define the problem, explore different solutions, and settle on the intervention with greatest potential for student success. In RTI schools, there are interventions that are called standard protocol interventions. That means that educators have developed specific ways to deal with certain problems that evidence show have a high probability of success when using these methods. For example, poor readers in the early grades often need extra instruction in phonics, and there are standard ways to teach phonics. And so it is not as if a school team needs to reinvent the wheel for every child. Thus, there may be several students in Tier 2, let's say for instance in the second grade, who may receive small group instruction using an evidence-based phonics curriculum for 5 days a week for 30 minutes a day. They would also continue to receive their Tier 1 intervention, their core reading instruction that's provided to all second grade children. But of course, nothing works for every child every time, so it's important that teachers monitor and assess intervention outcomes. And if the child is not improving, they try something different. Here's another example of data that teams would review. Take a look at this one. You see its data on several children, and it reflects accuracy and fluency in single-digit addition and subtraction. The rectangles on the graph are the zones of achievement that students are expected to demonstrate if they're making adequate progress. As you can see, the class as a whole did very well, with all kids meeting or exceeding criteria by the end of the fifth. But there was one child in light blue named Kia whose progress had fallen below expectations for several weeks. Therefore, Kia would be a good candidate for Tier 2 intervention. Here's another one. What story does this graph tell? Take a good look. What are your thoughts? Hopefully you saw that Sierra was not making adequate progress with Tier 1 instruction. After the 9th week, the school team initiated Tier 2 instruction, and Tier 2 was successful because by the 14th week, Sierra had caught up with grade level expectations as signified by the goal line. Additionally, many schools use RTI as their mechanism to identify whether or not a student has a learning disability. IDEA 2004 requires that states allow for the use of RTI as at least part of this process. Previously, many states used a failure model when identifying students who may have a learning disability. In other words, it wasn't uncommon that a student would struggle and fail before supports were put in place. This model is best known as the discrepancy model. The discrepancy model focuses on the discrepancy between the student's IQ, or their potential, and their achievement scores, where they're actually falling. While some states still use this discrepancy criteria in part for the LD identification, many include rich data from the RTI process to take a more proactive approach to identification. You see on this slide the classic graph that shows 3 tiers of intervention, with one system focused on academic instruction, that's RTI, and one system focused on social and behavioral instruction, that is positive behavior support, or PBS. It's worth noting that PBS is much simpler to implement than RTI and has had more success in terms of widespread dissemination. That is, more schools are farther along on their PBS programs than RTI programs. We'll cover PBS in the next video.